Hello everybody, let's have a fail focus. I know that you guys are finding these really useful and I've put a couple up fairly recently after having quite a long time of not having any, and I now have another fail focus that I would like to do for this particular PDI and of course the group as a whole. Now this PDI has for whatever reasons decided to be anonymous, which is absolutely fine. That goes for any of you if you're wanting a fail focus but you don't necessarily want to be named in that. So for the purpose of this fail focus, we're going to call this instructor James, and I'm going to make sure that James obviously knows this is for him. But this is James's recent experience, and James has taken a newly qualified full license holder to do a motorway lesson. Now I will make sure that you can see the emails, that you can see the feedback from the examiner and how the test has been marked, but you will see that James had a 5 for lesson planning, an 8 for risk management, so a safe lesson, although on that border, and a 12 for the teaching and learning strategies. Now the examiner's written feedback is that unfortunately the structure and the level of help or instruction required was below where it needed to be. You must be mindful to give directions, and there was a clear issue with the pupil not being fully aware of where she was going. Many opportunities available to aid learning were not used. Issues that happened were not identified. Be mindful that feedback and the debrief are to establish what went well or not and why. So James goes on to tell me that the main thing that the examiner said was that I was too quiet and I mainly left it for her to do things herself. I identified and recognised things that she did wrong, but didn't bring them up at the right time. In other words, I was too late. Directions weren't given in time, although I do think I gave some well in time, and clearly just not all of them. He did say it was a safe lesson, but felt no learning had taken place, though she had issues with reading and absorbing road signs too. Okay, so James, I think that perhaps one of the traps that you have fallen into, is a couple of main traps that you've fallen into, but one of them is to take up a full license holder, despite the fact this is a new full license holder, and do a motorway lesson is possibly, and I'm going to make an assumption here, not the normal pupil type that you take, and certainly not a normal lesson topic that you do. Now generally you guys who are not doing motorway lessons because of not being allowed to take a pupil on a motorway, those of you that are, and I am just going to put this little caveat out there, because I'm aware that I have certainly been in the presence of PDIs fairly recently who have gone to take pupils, and when I mean pupils I mean provisional license holders on motorways, and hadn't known that they were not allowed to do that. The rules are an ADI, so you need a green badge in a car fitted with dual controls, is allowed to take a provisional license holder pupil on, as long as obviously the ADI deems that pupil to be capable of doing that lesson. So that doesn't include you guys as PDIs. However, of course, you can take up a full license holder on a motorway as a PDI, so nothing is different about that. But because you guys perhaps are not doing motorways as frequently as maybe some of us are when we are popping onto motorways with our provisional license holders, there's the possibility that it's the kind of lesson that you don't necessarily have your script for. And when I mean your script, I mean words that are familiar, tools and techniques that you're using regularly enough to be part of a natural toolbox. And so what's happened is that you get onto a motorway lesson not necessarily having a very clear understanding of the motive of that lesson. So if I was to do a motorway lesson, I could reel you off the top 5 things that I would be thinking about when it comes to a motorway lesson. In other words, if I finish this motorway lesson and I have not covered this and this, I have failed at delivering an appropriate motorway lesson. So because I've got those things, and not only have I got those things, I've got ways of bringing them into the lesson, it becomes a more natural lesson for me. And I just wonder whether, James, you have fallen into the trap of doing a lesson that is not one of your showcased specialities. Okay, so that's the first thing that has possibly happened. The second thing that happened, which of course is linked into this very closely, is that the level of instruction has not been appropriate. And of course, sometimes when we take up a full license holder, there's a little bit of us that feels like we don't want to over-instruct. We don't want to fall into that trap of talking too much with somebody who is capable because they have a driving license. This pupil could have been on a motorway without any instructor. So there's nothing legally requiring her to have the motorway lesson. So what is it that you are going to do to make it an appropriate lesson? So that potential trap of thinking I cannot over-instruct and therefore going in the opposite direction and under-instructing. So when the examiner is saying that you have been too quiet and left her to do things herself, don't get me wrong, there's a time and a place where we're handing over responsibility, but it's responsibility with learning. There's a motive and a reason for perhaps some silence or handing over something for the pupil to be doing for themselves. But there has to be some depth. And if this is a new full license holder, this is a pupil who perhaps has not actually experienced motorways before, or certainly has only done so in a very limited capacity, the ability to go into detail, the ability for learning to take place, enough for an examiner and a pupil to say, wow, that was interesting. I've learned this, 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 and this. I'm now capable of doing this, 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 and this. And if I was to get on a motorway on my own, I would feel confident in being able to do this, 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 and this. And that takes talk, that takes conversation, that takes Q&A, that takes examples, that takes opportunities of putting them into situations again and again and again and reflecting and learning from it and having a really, really good on the move discussion in real time as things are being given to you. And of course, if you are quiet, learning is not going to take place. Now, in terms of the pupil learning and that thought about, well, perhaps, well, maybe she did come back, thought she came back better, and so you're not necessarily agreeing with the fact that when the examiner is saying, well, it was a safe lesson but no learning took place, what the examiner is meaning is everything that I've just said, but also we can get lured into perceiving that a pupil did come back 45 minutes later with 45 minutes worth of motorway experience and by the end of it was doing some things nicely. You guys need to remember there's a big difference between a pupil coming back better because of us or despite us. Okay? In other words, the role that we played was of not much consequence to the fact that learning has taken place. And what I mean by that is your average full license holder, stick them on a motorway, particularly if they are new, and give them 45 minutes, the chances are if she'd done a 45-minute motorway journey and you hadn't been there, she would have been self-reflecting, possibly even subconsciously, and come back better. So learning may well have happened from the point of view that she seemed to be doing things. It was not because of you, James, possibly even despite you. And that's what the examiner is talking about. Now, the fact that she had issues reading and absorbing road signs, this is a key word that you've used, James. So reading and absorbing road signs tells me that although you might feel that your directions were in good time, it was the absorption of the information the pupil struggled with, and that takes longer than you think. So you might have been given a direction in the way that perhaps you or I would be able to take a direction, but when a pupil is overloaded with other sensory stuff going on and things that she has to do, the ability to absorb, the ability to really hear, see, take in, think, come up with a plan and then instigate that plan is all about that absorption time. She didn't have time to do that, and therefore the examiner is noting that that wasn't recognised in the timing of your directions, particularly, I have to say, in a fast-moving environment. So if you are bombing along that motorway, you'll be surprised how much earlier a pupil will need to know what they are going to do to be able to put plans into place. And not just to put plans into place, but to talk through those plans, visualise those plans, think about what they would do if for some reason that plan was no longer appropriate. And that takes a long time, particularly while doing 70 miles an hour. So I think that's probably the trap you fall into, particularly as you say, James, that you thought that some of your directions were okay. I expect that they were okay for you, but not for your pupil, and that's what the examiner was meaning. Now, in terms of how that has been reflected in the scores, were directions and instructions given to the pupil clear and in good time. You have a 1 in there, and you can see why. But I also want you to remember that when it is about directions, it doesn't necessarily just mean about take the next slip road off on the left. It means giving the pupils some kind of verbal support, like check a middle mirror now, check a right mirror now, look at that black car coming up the side of us, have a good look and give me a judgment about when you think that you would move out without slowing him down, or when it would be too late. So that basically anything coming out of your mouth hasn't happened because it's been under instructing happening, and that is responsible for that 1 as well. Okay. The other ones are all related to everything I've said in terms of your style, the under instructing, the ability to not go into depth with all of those things that you needed to be talking about for learning to take place, so the detail that has been there, the feedback, and although there has been, by the looks of it, some situations that may have been potentially safety critical, so not actually safety critical, but potentially safety critical, because there are. You cannot drive for 45 minutes on a motorway and not have hundreds of potentially safety critical situations. There's not been the chat, there's not been the discussions, there's not been the what ifs, there's not been the plans or the solutions, and that has been where you have got the 1 for the potentially safety critical situations, and of course the feedback during the session. So those that's been that kind of knock-on effect. You also mention, as the examiner does, about there being some underlying other faults and just not talking about them, James. So of course, again, letting them go and not using opportunities to really focus on what perhaps isn't going particularly well and that the pupil is needing more experience of, and absolutely bringing them into the body of the lesson so that true learning can take place. Otherwise, what happens is it just becomes a bit of a feedback debrief. You get to the end, you run through the things that perhaps didn't go very well, and you don't have an opportunity to put them into practice, put the solutions into practice, and therefore learn. So have a little think about whether you've fallen into that trap, and it's all just been a little bit too basic. Okay. I hope that's useful for everybody, including you, James. I will make sure that you have got this video, and of course any of you can come back with any queries or questions that you have, and hopefully that has been a good exercise to do to make some of you think about either your own experiences or your future Part 3s. Thank you.